Part 2 of our screencast is going to focus on World War II. So we're going to take World War II all the way from kind of the reasons that America gets involved in the war, all the way to the conclusion of the war with the dropping of the atomic bomb, a decision made by our president at the time, Harry Truman. So let's get started with really kind of before World War II in a time period known as the interwar period. So in the time period between 1919, the end of the First World War, and 1941, when America enters into the Second World War, foreign policy-wise, we call this the interwar period in American history. And really what you're going to see is the growth of a mindset of isolationism within, not necessarily the American government per se, but a lot of Americans are kind of subscribing to this idea. So this is kind of more extreme than just neutrality. It's kind of like trying to isolate America politically from the rest of the world. Remember, we don't join the League of Nations. So we're not involved in their kind of like peacekeeping issues and trying to, deal with the rise of fascism and communism within European society. And so Americans are very much wanting to stay out of European conflicts and kind of isolate themselves away from the political problems that are happening in the world. Now, once conflict starts to break out in Europe and in Asia, what America is going to do is we're going to kind of go to our tried and true method of neutrality. So we saw this during the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, and again now in World War II. And so we're going to pass a series of neutrality acts. Neutrality Act of 1935, 1937, 1939. And essentially, they're all kind of focusing on the same concept of keeping America neutral and not taking a side during the war. Now, what's interesting about World War II, and the same thing happened in World War I, even though we're neutral, in a lot of ways, we are really favoring one side with the way that we're trading and the way that we're interacting during our neutrality. So, two programs that they create during World War II that really kind of benefit the Allied power side. So remember, in World War II, there's the Allied powers, which is in the beginning just France and Britain, really, and the other nations that Germany invades. And later on, the Soviet Union joins, and we join the Allied power side as well. And then you have the Axis powers, which is Japan, Germany, and Italy. Now, these programs really kind of disproportionately help the Allied powers out. And just like in World War I, our president is really kind of leaning towards supporting the Allied powers. Woodrow Wilson in World War I was kind of leaning towards supporting the Allies, and so is FDR. The issue here is the American public is not ready to get into these conflicts in 1939 for World War II, and in World War I, they weren't ready in 1914, 1915 to jump into these conflicts. And so these programs, so the first program is called Cash and Carry, and just as the name suggests, we were willing to supply war goods or supply products to the combatants in the war, mostly the Allied powers, if they were willing to come to the United States, pick up the items, and bring them back paying cash. And so that's kind of like our first program. And this is kind of stems from World War I, where we loaned a lot of money to European powers and didn't necessarily get it back. So we're trying to make sure that we get our money before we kind of sell these products. And that also stems from the fact that we're still in the Depression, during World War II. It takes World War II production levels to get America out of the Depression. The other program is called the Lend-Lease program. Now this is after Britain is really kind of struggling, and the Battle of London, the Battle of Britain is happening, and they're getting bombed routinely each night, and they're kind of running out of resources. We're going to implement this idea of Lend-Lease, where now we're willing to lend them equipment and lend them military supplies or lease it to them. And so, again, this does kind of show us in a lot of ways favoring more the Allied power side, although we do offer Lend-Lease not to Germany, but to other powers out there in the world, and the Soviet Union takes some goods using Lend-Lease, and so do a lot of other countries out there in the world. Now, what eventually brings the United States into the conflict is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this was a surprise attack on a U.S. naval base located in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now, originally our Pacific Fleet was located in California off the coast in San Diego, but when war kind of seemed imminent in the Pacific, or some kind of conflict potentially seemed imminent in the Pacific, we decided to move our Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii to make it more accessible to the South Pacific. And that's where the Japanese decided to use a surprise attack on the United States before we were actually engaged in the conflict. And the idea of the Japanese here is to try and knock out as much of the American naval fleet as possible so that it would be difficult for America to respond, and they would be able to conquer a lot of land and islands in the South Pacific, which is exactly what they were able to do. Now, the reason that one of the reasons that they're going to attack the United States here is because we put an oil embargo, and oil embargo among other items on Japan, because Japan was acting aggressively for years at this point, and they were in dire need of natural resources, and so America no longer wanted to help fuel their war machine and kind of cut off selling these major natural resources to the Japanese. The other one is they kind of saw the Americans as us as the major principal, competition for a South Pacific empire, because as we talked about in imperialism, we have been expanding into the South Pacific at this point for decades and decades, and so were the Japanese trying to expand into the South Pacific. So that brings us into the war kind of immediately and changes American perspective on the war pretty much overnight. Now, one of the big things we talked about during World War II is the way it affects people on the home front. And it affects production on the home front, but it also affects specifically women on the home front. So what you're looking at here is the famous, iconic propaganda poster of Rosie the Riveter, trying to convince women to leave their housewife role and go out into work into the factories. And this is aimed at really like middle-class women who didn't need to work in the past and might have never worked in the past. Women who were married, who traditionally was seen as they shouldn't be out working outside of the home, and they were trying to convince them to go out and work because production was needed. Men were overseas fighting in the military, and we needed to kind of produce for the war effort. And women, by and large, really kind of answer the call here and do kind of join the workforce and help to increase production tremendously. So this is a big I think, step in the women's rights movement towards working outside the home, some economic independence, and kind of moving towards these ideas that are going to kind of, spread in the 1960s and 1970s. The 1950s ends up being more of a conservative time period where women kind of go back as far as the domestic role within society. But the 1960s and 1970s kind of build off of some of the strides that are made during World War II. So that's an important, I think, element of gender equality that's growing during the war. Now, the other thing that's kind of going on the home front is that we need to kind of increase production. And so what the government does is they're going to make these contracts, defense contracts, with key companies, throughout American society. And really what you see happening here is something that we talked about, is the development of this military-industrial complex. Because of the war, a big piece of America's economy is tied to this wartime goods production. And you're going to see this kind of proliferated during the war because it helps America, obviously, to win the war. It also helps America to get out of the Great Depression, building these war goods and employing people. Employment drops to, basically what's considered full employment. I think the lowest in American history, somewhere around like 1.7% unemployment. But the other thing is that after the war is over, in order to kind of keep this economy to a certain extent growing and moving, we're going to kind of rely on production of military products, at least for a facet of our economy. And famously, Eisenhower, who becomes the president in the 1950s, warns in his farewell address about this military-industrial complex that really is kind of beginning here during World War II. But remember, one of the biggest points to remember about production on the home front is this is a huge part of what helps America to win the war. Without our ability to produce and our factories that we have back home, World War II might have gone in a very different direction. So that is a big part of what helps America to victory in World War II. Now, another thing happening on the home front is we're dealing with really this enemy-alien situation. So you have a lot of Americans who are from countries that we're now at war with. So that's the Japanese, that's Germans, that's Italians. Now, we're going to focus specifically, even though we talked about Italians and Germans as well in class, here we're going to focus just on the Japanese, because the Japanese get different treatment than the other two enemy combatant inhabitants of the United States. And what happens to the Japanese is that even Japanese who are born here in America, so American-born citizens of the United States of Japanese descent, are going to be placed in internment camps. So you're looking at some of the internment camps scattered throughout like the southwestern part of the United States. And really what these were camps to basically separate the Japanese community from the larger American population, because the government was fearful of spying, was fearful of potentially selling secrets back to Japan. And so essentially this is going to be challenged in a famous Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. And in the case, they side against Korematsu, who's Japanese, and he's suing, saying basically you're violating my rights as an American by forcing me to move to these locations. And the Supreme Court, again, similar to what they said in World War I, basically says that in a wartime situation, your rights can be limited as an American citizen. And so I think a lot of people kind of looking back at this years later look at this as a major tragedy in American history as far as the way that we treated the Japanese during World War II. Okay, what really is going to end the war in the Pacific theater? So the European theater ends before the Pacific theater, but what's going to end the war in the Pacific theater is the use of the atomic bomb. So we're going to drop 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese, one at Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and one at Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. And so this is a brand new technology and a highly destructive technology that the United States is going to implement. And we had a secretive project going throughout the entirety of World War II to build an atomic weapon, and so did all of the other powers within the war. So the Soviet Union had one, the Germans had one, to try and build an atomic weapon. And our program is called the Manhattan Project. Now, we were successful at building this atomic bomb, and once we did build the atomic bomb, this question, the decision became, should we use it? And that kind of fell on our Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States, Harry Truman at the time. And Truman makes the decision to use the atomic bomb, and a lot of that is kind of, I think, influenced by his desire to save American lives. It was projected by military experts at the time that an invasion of mainland Japan would cost like almost around an additional 1 million American lives. And so the manpower and the potential cost of an invasion of Japan was just too great, I think. And I think that played a huge role in why Truman decided to drop the atomic bomb. Now, when we talked about this in class, we also talked about other major factors that potentially went into Truman's decision, whether he was trying to intimidate the Soviet Union, which we talked about, like he's kind of seeing down the line as them as our next big enemy after the war, whether they didn't want to kind of share the post-war peacetime situation in Japan with the Soviet Union could have played a role. So all those other things kind of factored into Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb. So this kind of ends this time period of 1945 and ends World War II, but this decision kind of looms over the next time period 8, where we're dealing with the Cold War and this tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that really grows throughout that time period. Okay, so we're going to kind of wrap it there, and that'll kind of wrap time period 7 for us. And really, as far as our modified exam that we're taking this year, that really kind of wraps what we're going to be doing as far as time period reviews. And what we'll be trying to do in class next week is kind of look at topics over time and kind of do some analysis of continuity and change of different things over time, maybe some different thematic review, because that's usually the kinds of questions that will show up on your AP exam.